Shadow Milk Cookie. This is actually not about Shadow Milk Cookie, for the Siege of Truth is not actually Shadow Milk Cookie. Hello internet. I'm not going to say hello to the internet. So it occurred to me that the in-game short story that I call the costume fanfic for the costume set for Shadow Milk and Pure Vanilla is a reference to philosophy, and I don't understand why I've never seen anyone on the internet talk about this before. So I am here and I'm going to talk about it. I need this to be here somewhere, so this is the best thing that probably occurred to me. So yes, the short story in the game is a reference to Kant's philosophy. I feel the need to clarify why it would occur to me to think about one specific philosophy in the first place, because I feel like people, when talking about Shadow Milk Cookie, don't realize how much of a philosophical reference he is in the first place. So I'm gonna start from the beginning. So, Shadow Milk Cookie, in the lore, was, I guess, initially meant to represent knowledge. Now, knowledge is a concept which is one of the, not that many concepts that philosophy has throughout history preoccupied itself with studying, right? And since you're dealing with a cookie that is meant to represent an entire field of philosophy, the theory of knowledge is an entire field of philosophy, also known as epistemology. And obviously, if there is a blue cookie, a blue jester that I am obsessed with, that I think about on a regular basis, I am going to connect him to the philosophy that is probably relevant to the way they taught him out as a character. For yes, he is knowledge, so I'm going to read the philosophy of knowledge to understand who he is. Yes, I did read philosophy for a cookie. The devs also read philosophy for this cookie, and this short story in the costumes basically proves it. Side note, as a disclaimer, I want to say that I will probably not be using the proper philosophical terms to describe the things that I'm going to talk about, because I did not read philosophy in English, so I don't actually know them. If you've studied philosophy, this video will make you want to cry. I am very sorry. The one guy who is internationally known to be one of the guys who wrote about epistemology is Immanuel Kant. I also need to mention that there are references to Kant in Shadow Milk's main lore, like in episodes 7 and 8. But I'm not here to talk about the main lore and the Kant references. I'm here to talk about how the short story about the costumes is literally a summary of the idea that Kant argued against, and like refutation of material idealism and the critique of pure reason. So the summary for the costume fanfic, okay? It goes like, I'm sure everyone's read it because I've seen people talking about the Sage of Truth and Truthless Recluse on the internet, like based off of this costume fanfic, but I'm going to sum it up anyway. Basic summary is, there is the Sage of Truth, who's like a guy who just sits in a plaza by himself and just tells people about shit. He's like inspired, I'm pretty damn sure, from ancient Greek philosophers and the way they're known to have just like sat out in like public plazas and like debated like political and like sometimes philosophical, because to them like politics was basically philosophy, debated ideas and whatnot. This is what he's based off of, also shown by the fact that in his voicelines he says things about debates, which is ancient Greek. Oh, it's him in a plaza just like explaining a convoluted philosophical concept to a freshly baked flock wide-eyed with wonder, I guess. That's the quote. At the end of the day, when he's done, when people are going to sleep and it's sunset, it explicitly says that it's sunset, and Truthless Recluse comes to him like, stop teaching people about the truth because it's not fucking real. And then the sage is like, you have answered your own question as to why I'm teaching people about the truth. And then goes off about protecting seekers from the disappointment that there is no truth. And then he asks the sage again, like, why do you do it? And then he's like, one must not turn away from the light of one's own truth, which is kind of a Kant idea, but I will go into that later. And that's it. Then it ends. So, what is the philosophy behind this stupid costume fanfic? Basically, Truthless Recluse here represents the empiricist ideas, if for anybody who knows what I'm talking about, and the sage is literally just Kant. Very simply put, I think, maybe. Philosophy summary. There were the empiricists before Kant who believed that people, you as a person, as an individual with a mind and a consciousness, can only know the world around you, like the objects around you, through your own senses, like through actually touching them. It is basically impossible for you to know what the absolute concept or idea or like the thing that an object is made of. Like, I can only know the things in front of me, like, because I'm looking at them, I'm hearing them, I'm like touching them. I can't actually know what is at the base of the universe. Like, basically they said that the human mind has no way of knowing things on a deeper level. I guess a fitting example for this would be like absolute concepts like time. They thought that like one can only know time because we see, hear, and feel things like changing around us, and we have no way of knowing what the absolute concept of time is. And I have no way of knowing if my time is like different from someone else's time, because all I can know is based off of my own experiences of the world. They said that you can only know things after having experienced it. We as people have no way of knowing if what we know about a certain concept relates to anything of what it is, like at the very base, like the absolute idea of that concept. So how this philosophical view relates to the costume fanfic. The costume fanfic basically represents this as there is nothing at the peak of truth. Truth means a universal fact. It's something that is like true. Truth is something that is universally valid. Truth is an absolute concept. For something to be a truth, it means that is a valid idea in its absolution, under like any context and any circumstance, which is against what the empiricist tradition believes. Like, they think that people have no way of knowing what the absolute idea behind an object, behind a concept is. So what the short story is saying when it says there is nothing at the peak of truth, it says that there is no absolute truth, which is what the empiricists believe, that we as people can't know any absolute truth. Now, what Kant argues against this is that it's impossible to only know something from your own experiences, from your own senses, because the mind will have certain prejudices and ideas about those concepts on its own without having experienced something first. There is also to be said that the empiricists believe things that like objects basically only exist as long as the mind is able to perceive them, and that objects to be known can't be understood independently of someone's mind. Like, you can't know if this object is independent from your own mind or not, basically. Which, yeah, there is no truth, there is nothing at the peak of truth, is what the fanfiction says. It's literally talking about that concept. Now, Kant's main argument against this is the fact that for the mind to be able to be aware of its own existence, it needs to understand that there are also things that exist outside of it. And for things outside of it to exist, it means that there are objects independent of the mind, that there are those like absolute concepts and ideas. Kant also believes that you can't know them. This is against the rationalist tradition. He argues that you can't know what is the absolute idea behind an object, but like that is also to be brought up in the costume fanfic. That is what Kant argues against that philosophical idea, and you can see that Kant's main argument against this philosophy is pretty much literally worded in the costume fanfic when Truthless Recluse says, all too well, there is nothing at the peak of truth. And then Sage of Truth replies, at least the answer to the age-old question is found, why the recluse never leaves his beloved peak vacant. The important idea in this is the fact that the recluse never leaves his beloved peak vacant. So, because the peak of truth is the place where you find the absolute truth, which doesn't exist according to the imperialist ideas. But the Sage of Truth says, but no, the peak of truth isn't empty, because the recluse exists at the peak of truth, which is basically what Kant says. So, as Kant points out the contradiction in the empiricist belief that the mind can't be aware of its own existence without being aware of other objects which exist independently of it, the sage is also pointing out the exact contradiction in what the recluse says here, where the recluse says there is nothing at the peak of truth, and then the sage says, but there is, you are at the peak of truth, meaning that there is something at the peak of truth, meaning that truth exists, which would translate into Kant's philosophy, meaning that there are objects independent of our mind. My point is, the sage of truth is Kant, which is further proven by what he says later, if I can find the quote. I'm not gonna talk about like protecting seekers from disappointment, because that's just plot to be fun. Now, the second part of Kant's philosophy. Kant arguing against rationalists, the metaphysicists like Leibniz. A rationalist. I've said what I've talked about what empiricists believe. Now, what rationalists believe is that the world is basically made out of something. That's what metaphysics is. Metaphysics is the field that is basically telling you what the world is made out of at its very core, like what the absolute part of an object is. And metaphysicists believe you can know the absolute part of an object through logical reasoning. Kant argues against this by introducing the concept of antinomies, which I'm not going to explain right now. Which is basically, well, it basically says that, like, if you apply reason to try to understand absolute concepts, you will reach contradictions. That's basically what it is. I'm not going to give examples or explain it in more depth. So, after arguing against the idea that the human mind can know the absolute part of an object through logic and reason, Kant reaches the conclusion that while absolute parts of objects do exist, the human mind can only know so much of an object through experience. Now, this conclusion that Kant got to after arguing against the true pre-existing philosophical beliefs before him is also reflected in the costume fanfic. When Sage of Truth says, alas, the truth is imperfect by design, translates into Kant's conclusion that the mind can't know it without experiencing the object at all. And then the sage continues by saying, one must not turn away from the light of one's own truth, which again, basically saying from the conclusion that Kant drew from his philosophy, that the mind can know so much of an object which does exist in absolution, but only as far as it can experience it. And that's it. The Sage of Truth is Kant, guys. The Sage of Truth is Kant. There's like 3 lines, which are like the important lines of this. What else is there to be mentioned? Because my brain got a little obsessed with Shadow Make's silly Sage of Truth costume, which I think looks terrible, by the way. The idea present in Kant's philosophy also show in the Sage of Truth's voice lines, like 3 of them, from what I found on the wiki. Now, if these aren't accurate, blame the wiki, because I don't have this costume. But there is 2 voice lines in his arena voice lines. One which says, will your truth prevail over mine? Again, there is truth, but we can only know it from our own experiences. Then everyone fights for their own truth, same idea. And then the perfect truth, that depends on the cookie, which is a quote from when you level him up. So, Kant references. Conclusion. What is the conclusion? The conclusion is Shadow Milk, Cookie, and philosophy. Also, if this doesn't make any sense, it's because I don't have a script. I have talking points. I don't have an actual proper script, and I'm trying to explain philosophy with my own words out of my own mind, which is dumb and stupid. The writers clearly read philosophy for Shadow Milk, Cookie, and I'm upset nobody's talking about it. Like, come on, guys. Tell me, read up on the theory of knowledge, on fucking epistemology, and tell me about Shadow Milk. Tell me which philosophy you see in Shadow Milk, because I see one, but it's really obscure. Maybe I'll talk about it at some point. Maybe not. I don't know. Please read Philosophy for Shadow Milk, guys. I swear to God, if I see one more person say that like Shadow Milk's knowledge means truth, as in objectively true facts, like mathematically true facts, I will actually go insane. There is so much philosophy put into the story of this goddamn blue cookie. If I see that one more time, I'm going to go insane. Anyways, that is it. This is my rant.